Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that's haunted Hampton Court Palace for nearly 200 years. A sound that shouldn't exist, a woman who won't leave, and a mystery that connects Tudor devotion to Victorian terror. If you're settling in for this one, go ahead and hit subscribe, but only if this is actually your thing. No pressure either way. Drop a comment if you want. Tell me where you are right now, what time it is, whether you're winding down or just starting your day. I love seeing how this stuff travels. Alright, get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights if you haven't already. Turn on a fan if you like that white noise. Whatever helps you settle in. Let's go. In 1829, lightning struck a church near Hampton Court Palace. Workers demolished the building, moved the tombs, disturbed the dead. And immediately, people started hearing it. The whirring of a spinning wheel. Coming from inside the palace walls, a woman's voice muttering. The sound of someone working. Someone who'd been dead for 267 years. When they broke down the wall, they found a sealed room. No one knew it existed. Inside, an antique spinning wheel. The floorboards worn away where the treadle had struck them. Years of use, decades maybe, and then the room had been sealed. Forgotten. But here's what they don't tell you in the ghost tour pamphlets. The woman they say haunts Hampton Court, Sybil Penn, the Grey Lady, she didn't die in some tragic accident. She didn't get murdered or betrayed or executed. She died doing exactly what she'd done for 24 years. Taking care of people, serving, protecting. She died nursing Queen Elizabeth I through smallpox. And when Elizabeth survived and changed the course of history, Sybil Penn contracted the disease herself. 3 weeks after the Queen recovered, Sybil was dead. So tonight we're asking, is the Grey Lady really Sybil Penn? And if it is, why is she still there? Why the spinning wheel? Why Hampton Court? And why, almost 200 years after someone disturbed her grave, do people still report seeing her? This isn't just a ghost story. It's a story about what happens when loyalty becomes so absolute it might transcend death itself. Let's start at the beginning. October 1538, Hampton Court Palace, and a woman who's about to be given the most terrifying job in all of England. Sybil Penn, though her maiden name was Hampton, came from Buckinghamshire gentry. Not nobility, not peasants. Somewhere in the comfortable middle where you had land, connections, and just enough status to matter. Her family had been around for 300 years. The Hamptons of the Hill. Respectable. Connected. She married David Penn of Penn, Buckinghamshire. Another gentry family. More land, more connections. And by 1538, Sybil had 5 children of her own. John, Mary, Margaret, Edward, Thomas. 5 young kids who needed their mother. And that's when the summons came. October 1538. Prince Edward was about a year old, Henry VIII's only surviving male heir, the boy who represented England's entire future, after decades of desperate attempts to secure the succession. Let me put this in perspective. Henry had broken with Rome over his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, dissolved hundreds of monasteries, confiscated their wealth, executed anyone who opposed him, including his own Lord Chancellor, Thomas More, executed 2 wives, watched 3 others die or be set aside, all to get a legitimate male heir, and now that heir existed. October 12th, 1537, Prince Edward, born to Jane Seymour, Henry's 3rd wife, the King's joy, England's hope, the answer to everything. Jane Seymour died 12 days later, probably from puerperal fever, infection after childbirth. She was 28 years old. Henry was devastated, but he had his son. That's what mattered. That's what everything had been for. 1 year old, fragile, precious beyond measure. Someone needed to take care of him. Not a wet nurse. He'd already been weaned by 1538. Someone else. A dry nurse. The woman who would take over after breastfeeding ended. The nanny. The caregiver. The surrogate mother who would basically raise this child. The person who would be responsible for keeping this child alive. They chose Sybil Penn. You're in your early 30s, 5 children at home who need you. Your youngest probably still quite young, and someone probably through your family connections at court tells you, leave your family, come live at Hampton Court, take care of the most important child in England. If he gets sick, it's your fault. If he dies, it's your fault. The entire Tudor succession rests on this one fragile infant. You'll be the one sleeping beside him every night, feeding him, dressing him, making sure he stays alive. The weight of an entire dynasty on your shoulders. But Sybil said yes. Maybe she didn't have a choice. When the king summons you to serve the prince, you serve. But maybe she wanted to. Maybe the opportunity to serve royalty, to be at the centre of court life, to secure her family's future. Maybe that was worth leaving her own children for. We don't know what she felt, whether it tore her apart to leave John, Mary, Margaret, Edward and Thomas, whether she went eagerly or reluctantly. We just know she went, and she stayed for 24 years. Here's what mistress nurse to a royal prince actually meant in 1538. Henry VIII was obsessed with protecting Edward. Paranoid doesn't even cover it. This child was everything. The justification for all the chaos of the previous decade. The air that made it all worthwhile. The nursery at Hampton Court was a fortress. The walls, floors and ceilings were washed down 3 times daily with soap and water. Every surface scrubbed. No dirt, no dust, nothing that might harbour disease. Every piece of food was tested before serving. Someone else ate it first, waited to see if they got sick. Only then was it given to Edward. Every garment was washed multiple times and anointed with perfume. Nothing touched the prince's skin unless it had been thoroughly cleaned. Any servant who showed even a hint of illness, a cough, a fever, a rash, was immediately expelled from the household. Not allowed back until they were completely well. Visitors were limited, carefully screened. You didn't just drop by to see the prince. The entire household revolved around one purpose, keeping this child alive. And Sybil stood at the centre of it all. According to family accounts passed down through generations, and later recorded by historians, Sybil slept with the young prince every night for 5 years. Every night, until he was 6 years old and deemed old enough to transition to male tutors. Think about what that means. For 5 years, she was the last person Edward saw before he fell asleep, and the first person he saw when he woke up. When he cried in the night, she was there. When he had nightmares, she comforted him. When he was sick, she held him. She oversaw every aspect of his care, fed him, dressed him, bathed him, played with him, read to him, taught him his first words, watched him take his first steps. For 5 years, she was everything he knew. The last face before sleep, the first voice in the morning. She probably knew him better than his father did. Henry VIII loved Edward, his son, his heir, his legacy, but in an abstract way. The way you love an idea or a symbol. Sybil knew the real child, the boy who was afraid of loud noises, who liked certain foods and refused others, who had a favourite blanket or toy, who needed to be held just so when he was upset. The most vivid account of their bond comes from a court presentation, sometime around 1541, 1542. Important dignitaries were visiting. Foreign ambassadors, maybe, or powerful English lords. The kind of people a future king needed to meet, needed to impress. Protocol demanded that the young prince be brought in, presented, shown off as evidence of Tudor success. Sybil dressed him carefully, made sure he looked perfect, carried him into the grand hall where these intimidating men waited. Edward was maybe 3 or 4 years old enough to understand that these were important people, old enough to feel scared. He took one look at the strangers, tall men in elaborate clothing, beards, stern faces, all staring at him, and panicked. He refused to look at them, turned his face away, and clung to Sybil, buried his face in her neck. Right there, in front of everyone, Instead of being a proper little prince, he just pressed his face against his nurse's neck and refused to engage. Her scent, her warmth, her familiar presence, that was real to him. That was safe. Not the distant figure of his father sitting on a throne somewhere. Not these intimidating strangers. Just Sybil, the woman who held him when he was frightened, who soothed him when he cried, who made everything okay. That moment tells us everything we need to know about their relationship. In 1541, when Edward was about 3, he fell dangerously ill with fever. High fever. The kind that could kill a child in a matter of days before modern medicine. The kind that every parent dreaded. And in Edward's case, it wasn't just a sick child. It was the potential end of the Tudor dynasty. The collapse of everything Henry had worked for. Sybil nursed him through it. We don't know the exact details, what the illness was, how long it lasted, how close Edward came to dying, but we know Sybil was there, through all of it, probably not sleeping, certainly not leaving his side, bathing him with cool water to bring down the fever, forcing liquids down his throat to keep him hydrated, watching for any sign that he was getting worse. And slowly, agonizingly slowly, Edward recovered. When Henry VIII heard that his son had survived, that the danger had passed, he was so relieved, so grateful, that he rewarded Sybil in a way that changed her family's fortunes forever. He granted her life rights to extensive properties in Penn Village and Great Missenden, Buckinghamshire. Not just small parcels, extensive estates. The grant nearly tripled the Penn family's land holdings. This wasn't a small gesture. This was a massive transfer of wealth and status. According to family tradition, Henry also gave her a pearl necklace. The necklace still exists. 500 years later, it's been passed down through Sybil's descendants. In 2013, experts examined it and confirmed it dates from the mid-16th century. Uneven pearls. Real pearls, not imitations. They've lost their natural luster over 450 years. Pearls degrade over time, the nacre breaking down, but they're genuine. Henry VIII gave his son's nurse a pearl necklace for keeping the prince alive. Let that sink in. A king, a man who executed people on a whim, who dissolved monasteries and broke with Rome and tore England apart to get his way. That man was so grateful to a gentrywoman for saving his son that he gave her property and pearls. That's how much she mattered. That's how much Edward mattered. But at age 6, everything changed for Edward. 6 was the age when boys stopped being children and started becoming men. When they were breeched, taken out of the long gowns that both boys and girls wore, and dressed in doublet and hose, adult-style male clothing. When they left the women's world of the nursery and entered the men's world of education, training, combat. In 1544, when Edward turned 6, Henry VIII issued an order. All female attendants were to be dismissed from the prince's household immediately, including Sybil Penn. No transition period, no gradual handoff, no chance for goodbyes. Just, you're done. Pack your things. Leave. One historian later noted this was done with no regard for the bonds that the young prince had forged with them. And the bonds were profound. For nearly 60 years, from age 1 to age 6, Sybil had been Edward's constant companion, his protector, his comfort, the only mother figure he'd ever really known. Henry VIII's wives kept dying or getting executed. Edward's actual mother, Jane Seymour, had died when he was 12 days old. He had no memory of her. His first stepmother, Anne of Cleves, was divorced when Edward was 2. Gone. His second stepmother, Catherine Howard, was executed for adultery when Edward was 4. There one day, dead the next. His third stepmother, Catherine Parr, came along when Edward was 5. She was kind to him, took an interest in his education, but she wasn't the woman who'd held him every night since he was a baby. Sybil Penn was the closest thing to a mother Edward had ever had, and then one day, she was just gone. Picture yourself at 6 years old. You go to bed one night, and the woman who's always been there tucks you in like always. You wake up the next morning and she's not there. Someone else is. A man, a tutor, Someone who treats you like a prince, not like a child. No explanation, no goodbye, just gone. That had to be traumatic. Edward was a sensitive, intelligent child. He was being trained to be king. He understood duty. He probably understood on some level why the female attendants had to leave. But understanding doesn't make it hurt less. Here's how we know he never forgot her. Throughout his brief reign, from 1547 when Henry died until Edward's own death in 1553, he gave Sybil New Year's gifts of 10 shillings. Every year, without fail. 10 shillings wasn't a fortune, but it was a deliberate gesture. New Year's gifts at the Tudor court were carefully calculated. You gave them to people you valued, people you wanted to honour. Edward was king. He had a lot of people to think about. Courtiers angling for favour, foreign ambassadors bringing gifts and expecting reciprocation, family members, advisors, and every year he remembered his old nurse, the woman who'd slept beside him for 5 years, who'd held him when he buried his face in her neck, who'd saved his life when he was 3. He didn't forget, and in June 1553, just weeks before his death, Edward performed his final act of gratitude. By this point, Edward knew he was dying. He was 15 years old, suffering from what was probably tuberculosis, though some historians think it was a lung infection, complicated by other illnesses. Maybe even arsenic poisoning from the treatments his physicians were giving him. He couldn't breathe properly. He was coughing up blood. His body was wasting away. He knew he didn't have long. And in the middle of all that, while his counsellors were fighting over the succession, while Lady Jane Grey was being positioned as his heir, while religious and political factions were preparing for civil war, Edward did something remarkable. He converted all the life rights his father had granted Sybil Penn into freeholds in perpetuity. Life rights meant she could use the properties during her lifetime. When she died, they'd revert to the crown or go elsewhere. Freeholds meant she owned them outright, forever, and her heirs would own them after her. This was a massive gift, a permanent transfer of wealth that would benefit her descendants for generations. Edward was dying, 15 years old, surrounded by political chaos, worried about his legacy, about who would rule after him, about whether England would stay Protestant or return to Catholicism under Mary, and he made sure his old nurse was taken care of, not just during her lifetime, forever. Her direct descendant, Earl Howe, still holds the patronage of Penn and Little Missenden churches today, over 450 years later. Edward died on July 6, 1553, probably around 6 in the evening, in his rooms at Greenwich Palace, surrounded by counsellors and physicians and people manoeuvring for political advantage. But somewhere in that chaos, Sybil Penn heard the news, the little boy she'd raised, the prince who'd clung to her when he was frightened, the king who'd remembered her every year. Dead at 15, she attended his funeral, dressed in mourning, walking in the procession, watching as they lowered the coffin into the ground at Westminster Abbey. The boy who'd buried his face in her neck was gone, and she was left to serve the next monarch. After Edward's death, Sybil didn't retire. She didn't go home to Buckinghamshire and live quietly on her properties. She was probably in her 40s by then. She'd spent 15 years at court, and she stayed. Under Mary I, Bloody Mary, though we're not getting into that tonight, Sybil served as a woman of the Queen's Privy Chamber. This wasn't a minor position. Women of the Privy Chamber had constant access to the Queen. They helped her dress, attended her in private, witnessed her most vulnerable moments. These weren't just servants, they were companions, confidantes, the women a queen actually spent time with when the public mask came off. On September 30th, 1553, just 3 months after Edward's death, Sybil rode in Mary's royal entry procession. The next day, October 1st, she attended Mary's coronation, wearing a scarlet gown furred with lettuce, grey weasel fur. The same distinctive costume given to other high-ranking court ladies. In 1556, Mrs. Penn gave Queen Mary half a dozen handkerchiefs edged with gold passamine lace as a New Year's gift. Think about that. A servant giving the Queen handkerchiefs. Not valuable jewels or elaborate gifts, just handkerchiefs. Personal, intimate, the kind of gift you give someone you actually know. Sybil Penn had known Mary since Mary was a child, had probably helped care for her during the years Sybil served Edward. And now Mary was Queen, and Sybil was there for her. On November 14th, 1558, Sybil attended Mary's funeral, rode in a chariot with other ladies, wore mourning clothes with barbes, veils under their chins. 2 queens down, 1 to go. When Elizabeth I took the throne in 1558, Sybil Penn became a lady of the bedchamber, even more intimate than her position with Mary. Ladies of the bedchamber had access to the most private spaces, the bedchamber, the moments when no one else was watching. Sybil had known Elizabeth since infancy, had cared for her when Elizabeth was a princess living in her brother Edward's household. And now Elizabeth was queen, and Sybil, in her 50s, attended the woman who had become England's ruler. Her memorial epitaph would later celebrate this unprecedented service. 2 queens that sceptre bore gave credit to this dame. Full many years in court she dwelt, without disgrace or blame. 24 years, 4 monarchs, 2 religious revolutions, the break with Rome under Henry, Protestant reforms under Edward, Catholic restoration under Mary, Protestant settlement under Elizabeth. And through all of it, Sybil Penn remained, trusted, valued, never executed, never exiled, never disgraced. In the treacherous world of Tudor politics, where careers could end with an executioner's axe and yesterday's loyalist became today's traitor, Sybil Penn survived. She lived at Hampton Court in some of the best rooms on the West Front, overlooking the drawbridge. She also owned a house at Penn Place on Church Street in Hampton. The Penn family prospered from her service. Her marriage to David Penn and her royal appointments trebled the family's property. 24 years of continuous service. From Prince Edward's nursery in 1538 to Queen Elizabeth's bedchamber in 1562. And then in October 1562, everything changed. October 10th, 1562, Hampton Court Palace. Queen Elizabeth I was 29 years old. Just 4 years into her reign, England was finally stable after decades of chaos. The religious settlement was holding. Protestant, but not radically so. Elizabeth had found a middle way that most people could live with. The Catholic threats from Spain and France were being managed through careful diplomacy. The economy was recovering from the chaos of previous reigns. Elizabeth was unmarried, which was a constant source of anxiety for her counsellors. Who would inherit if she died? But she was young, healthy, there was time. And then she caught what she thought was a cold. She'd been at Hampton Court for a few weeks. October weather in England, damp, chilly, unpredictable. She felt achy, feverish, tired. Everyone around her probably thought, it's just a cold, she'll rest, she'll recover, it's nothing. Elizabeth herself didn't seem worried. When she started feeling feverish, she did what she thought would help. She took a hot bath. Her courtiers were horrified. Hot baths were considered dangerous when you were already ill. They believed bathing opened your pores, made you vulnerable to disease entering your body. It was weakening, foolish, but Elizabeth was stubborn. She'd always been stubborn. She took the bath. It didn't help. By October 15th, just 5 days after the symptoms started, she was apologising in letters to Mary, Queen of Scots, that a hot fever prevented her from writing more. Her condition deteriorated rapidly. Not the slow decline of a lingering illness. Fast, aggressive, terrifying. By October 16th, just 6 days after the initial symptoms, the diagnosis was announced. Smallpox. The word alone was enough to create panic. Smallpox was one of the deadliest diseases of the age. There was no cure, no effective treatment. You either survived or you died, and it was basically a coin flip which you'd get. 30% mortality rate. 1 in 3 people who contracted smallpox died. and survivors were often left horribly scarred, disfigured, sometimes blind. The Spanish ambassador Bishop Álvaro de la Cuadra sent urgent dispatches back to Spain. His job was to monitor English politics and report anything significant, and this was very significant. "The Queen has been ill of fever at Kingston," he wrote, "and the malady has now turned to smallpox. The eruption cannot come out, and she is in great danger. If the Queen die, it will be very soon, within a few days at latest, and now all the talk is who is to be her successor." Read that again. The eruption cannot come out. That's the key phrase. The detail that meant Elizabeth was probably going to die. In smallpox, the characteristic pustules, the pus-filled sores that gave the disease its name, need to erupt on the skin. That's how the body expels the infection. If the pustules don't come out, if they stay internal, the patient almost always dies. And Elizabeth's spots weren't appearing. Her symptoms progressed with terrifying speed. Violent fever that made her delirious, severe debility. She was so weak she couldn't sit up. Loss of the power of speech. She literally couldn't talk. By the 7th day of illness, October 16th, she'd fallen into a coma. She was unconscious, non-responsive, and still no spots. Her physicians gave up hope. They'd done everything they knew how to do. Bled her to balance her humours, given her herbal remedies, prayed. Nothing worked. Elizabeth was dying. 29 years old. 4 years into her reign. No heir, no designated successor, no plan. The Privy Council, the group of powerful men who advised the Queen and basically ran the government, hastily convened. Not in some remote meeting chamber, in an adjoining room at Hampton Court, while Elizabeth lay dying just down the hall. They had to figure out who would succeed her, and they had to figure it out fast, because if Elizabeth died without a clear successor, England would descend into civil war. The Wars of the Roses were less than a century past. Living memory for some of the older council members. 30 years of brutal civil war between the houses of York and Lancaster. Entire noble families destroyed, towns burned, the country torn apart. It had ended with Henry VII taking the throne. In 1485, his son Henry VIII had consolidated Tudor power. His son Edward VI had seemed to secure the succession, but Edward had died at 15. His half-sister Mary had taken the throne, ruled for 5 years, and died. And now Elizabeth, the last of Henry VIII's children, was dying at 29. If she died now, who had the best claim? The candidates were hopelessly divided. Mary, Queen of Scots, was the hereditary heir. She was Elizabeth's second cousin, descended from Henry VII through his daughter Margaret. By bloodline alone, she had the strongest claim. But Mary was Catholic. She was married to the French Dauphin. She was basically a French puppet. Half of England, the Protestant half, would never accept her. Lady Catherine Grey was another option. She was Protestant, a good English girl, granddaughter of Henry VIII's younger sister Mary. But there were problems. Catherine had married the Earl of Hertford without Elizabeth's permission. The marriage had been declared invalid. Her sons were considered illegitimate, and Elizabeth hated her, had imprisoned her in the Tower. There was no consensus. The Privy Council couldn't agree. Different factions supported different candidates, religious divisions, political divisions, personal rivalries. If Elizabeth died now, in October 1562, England would tear itself apart. The spectre of foreign intervention loomed. Spain might support Mary, Queen of Scots. France definitely would. Would England become a battlefield for Catholic powers trying to restore papal authority? That's why the Privy Council was meeting in the room next door, arguing, desperate, terrified, and then Elizabeth briefly recovered consciousness for just a few minutes, long enough to realise where she was, long enough for her counsellors to rush in. They pressed her, immediately, urgently. Name your successor. Tell us who you want. Give us direction. Elizabeth refused, even dying. Even after being unconscious for days. even with her country on the brink of civil war. She refused to name a successor. Instead, she made a shocking request. She wanted Robert Dudley, her favourite, possibly the man she loved, to be appointed protector of the realm with an annual salary of £20,000. The councillors were horrified. Dudley was controversial. His wife had died 2 years earlier under suspicious circumstances, fallen downstairs at home while Dudley was at court. Everyone suspected murder. Rumours swirled that Elizabeth and Dudley were lovers, that they'd conspired to kill his wife so they could be together. No proof was ever found. The coroner ruled it an accident, but the rumours never died. Elizabeth assured them, dying barely conscious, struggling to speak, that although she loved Lord Robert, nothing improper had ever passed between them. But she still wouldn't name a successor. The councillors left her bedchamber, went back to their frantic debate. When Elizabeth later learned they'd been discussing her successor while she lay dying, that they'd been planning for her death, dividing up power, manoeuvring for position, she wept with rage. That's who Elizabeth I was, even unconscious, even dying, even with England's future hanging by a thread. She refused to give up control, but on October 16th, she was dying. And then Elizabeth's cousin, Lord Hunsdon, did something desperate. He summoned a German physician named Cranach Burchard, called Dr. Burko by the English, a foreign doctor, not part of the royal medical establishment, someone with different ideas. Dr. Burko examined the unconscious queen, looked at her symptoms, felt her forehead, and announced he could save her. But only if they did exactly what he said. The Privy Council was sceptical, but what choice did they have? Their own physicians had given up. Elizabeth was dying anyway, might as well try. Dr. Burkott employed what was known as the red treatment. This was an Arab-Japanese practice that had been used in Europe since the 12th century, based on the theory that colours had healing properties. Red was believed to draw disease out of the body and prevent scarring. He wrapped the unconscious queen from the neck down in red flannel cloth, bright red, covering everything below her face. Then he ordered servants to build up the fire, make it rage, make the room incredibly hot. And he placed Elizabeth, wrapped in red flannel, close to the fire. So close she must have been drenched in sweat. The heat must have been unbearable, but she was unconscious. She couldn't protest. For 2 hours, Dr. Burko kept Elizabeth wrapped in red flannel beside a raging fire. It sounds insane. It was insane. There's no medical basis for it. The theory was nonsense. Red cloth doesn't cure disease. But within 2 hours of this treatment, something miraculous happened. Elizabeth woke up. She regained consciousness. She had recovered her power of speech. She was weak, exhausted, confused, but she was alive and aware. On October 17th, just one day after everyone thought she would die, the Spanish ambassador sent a new dispatch. The Queen is now better, as the eruption has appeared. The pus-filled sores characteristic of smallpox had finally erupted on her skin. First, small spots appeared, red bumps spreading across her face, her neck, her hands. Then over the next several days they developed into fluid-filled blisters, which grew larger, became painful, filled with thick, opaque pus. This eruption, while horrific to witness, signalled that the contagion was passing through her body and out through her skin. She would likely survive. By October 23rd, Elizabeth had clearly turned the corner. The pustules were beginning to scab over. The fever was breaking. She was going to survive. England's future was secured. The succession crisis was averted. For now. But the victory came at a terrible human cost. Let me tell you what smallpox actually was in 1562. This was before germ theory, before anyone understood viruses, before there was any effective treatment beyond supportive care. Smallpox was caused by the variola virus, though no one knew that. They thought it was caused by an imbalance of humours, by bad air, by God's judgment. The disease began suddenly. You'd wake up one morning feeling fine. By afternoon, you'd have a high fever. violent chills, crushing headache, severe muscle pain, especially in your back and shoulders, debilitating fatigue, nausea, vomiting. For the first few days, it felt like severe flu. Then around day 5, the rash began. Small red spots appeared first inside the mouth and throat, then spreading to the face, then the arms, then the trunk and legs. This was the diagnostic moment. Once you saw the characteristic rash, you knew. Smallpox. Between days 10 and 14, the nightmare truly began. The red spots evolved into bumps. The bumps filled with thick, opaque pus. They became swollen, painful sores with characteristic depressions in the centre, like someone had pressed their thumb into each one. These were the pox that gave the disease its name. In severe cases called confluent smallpox, pustules were so numerous they merged together. The skin became taut like leather. The face swelled grotesquely. Features became unrecognisable. Pustules erupted not just on the skin, but inside the mouth, throat, and respiratory tract, making swallowing agonising, making breathing difficult. Every time you tried to eat or drink, you'd feel those sores tearing. The smell was foul. Pustules leaked. The infection had a distinctive odour that people who'd experienced it never forgot. Around days 15 to 19, the pustules crusted over, forming thick, painful scabs. This was when caregivers were most likely to contract the disease. The scabs were highly infectious, touching them, handling contaminated bedding, breathing the air in the sick room. This is when Sybil Penn would have been most at risk. As Lady of the Bedchamber, Sybil Penn was among Queen Elizabeth's closest female attendants during those desperate October weeks. She had known Elizabeth since childhood, had likely helped care for her when Elizabeth was a princess in her brother Edward's household. Now, in her 50s, Sybil nursed the woman who had become queen through the most dangerous illness of the age. The intimate care required for a smallpox patient meant constant, close contact during the most infectious period. Ladies of the bedchamber would have managed the fever with cool cloths and ventilation, prevented the queen from scratching the lesions, provided nourishment and liquids, offered comfort during delirium, changed infected linens, maintained isolation from others. This care required touching the scabs and pus-filled sores, handling contaminated bedding, breathing the air in the Queen's chamber, spending hour after hour in close proximity. Lady Mary Sidney, sister of Robert Dudley, also nursed Elizabeth devotedly. She survived, but she was terribly disfigured. Her husband Henry Sidney later wrote, "I left her a full fair lady in mine eye, at least the fairest, and when I returned I found her as foul a lady as the smallpox could make her." Mary Sidney largely withdrew from court life after that. She continued occasional service, but her beauty was gone, her face destroyed. The contrast was stark. Elizabeth survived with minimal scarring and continued her glorious reign. Mary Sidney survived but lost her beauty and much of her court life. And Sybil Penn? Sybil Penn contracted smallpox while nursing the Queen. She died at Hampton Court Palace on November 6, 1562. Less than 3 weeks after Elizabeth's recovery, she was probably around 54 years old. The line in her epitaph proved prophetic. "Before each joy, yea, and her life, her prince's health preferred." Before each joy, yes, and her life, her prince's health preferred. She had literally put her queen's health before her own life. She'd nursed Prince Edward through illness in 1541, witnessed his death in 1553, served Mary I until her death in 1558, and her final act was nursing Elizabeth I. And dying in that service, she was buried in the chancel of St Mary's Church in Hampton, near Hampton Court Palace. An elaborate monument was erected, a life-sized recumbent effigy of her lying under a marble canopy supported on pillars. 5 cartouches of arms on the front and ends, 2 enriched Corinthian columns, and corresponding pilasters supporting a flat canopy with entablature carved with large strapwork. The monument was extraordinarily elaborate for someone of her station, testimony to the royal favour she'd earned. An inscription tablet on the wall bore the full rhyming epitaph celebrating her service. Elizabeth left Hampton Court shortly after Sybil Penn's death. Though she would return occasionally for religious feasts, she rarely visited the palace again after her brush with death there. The loss of her old nursemaid, who had cared for her since childhood and sacrificed her life in service, clearly affected the Queen deeply. For 267 years, Sybil Penn rested peacefully in her tomb. There were no ghost stories, no hauntings, no disturbances. Whatever rest the dead could find, she seemed to have found it. Then came 1829. In 1829, St. Mary's Church in Hampton was struck by lightning. The old building needed to be demolished and rebuilt. The church was closed on December 27, 1829. Construction began on a new structure designed by architect Edward Lappage. During the renovation, Sybil Penn's impressive monument had to be moved from the chancel to a new location near the staircase leading to the organ loft. According to contemporary reports, the tomb was irreverently disturbed and her remains scattered. When the tomb was opened, workers found only a little yellow hair and a few hairpins. No body was present. This absence had two possible explanations. Either Sybil's body had been previously removed. Her husband, David Penn, had died in 1565, just over 2 years after Sybil. His will directed that his body be buried in Penn Chancel among mine ancestors, and that Sybil's body be removed from Hampton to lie beside him. So maybe the body had been moved centuries earlier, or maybe something else had happened to the remains over 267 years. The mystery of the missing body would become part of the legend. Immediately after the tomb disturbance, strange phenomena began at Hampton Court Palace. Approximately 1 mile from the church, the Ponsonby family was living in Grace and Favour apartments at Hampton Court in 1829. They were the first to report disturbances. At first they thought it was rats in the walls, or old pipes, or the building settling, but the sound was too specific, too rhythmic, too purposeful. A persistent whirring, like a wheel turning, and accompanying it, a woman's voice, muttering. The words unclear, but the tone unmistakable. Someone working, someone concentrating, someone who had a task to complete. The sounds always came from the same location, behind the wall of their apartment, in the southwest wing, always around the same time, late evening, after dark, when the palace was settling into sleep. Mrs. Ponsonby reported it to palace officials. They investigated, listened at the wall, heard nothing. Old buildings make noise, they said. It's just the wood settling. But the Ponsonbys weren't the only ones hearing it. Other residents in neighbouring apartments reported the same thing. That whirring sound, that muttering voice, always from behind the walls. Maintenance workers started refusing to work in that section alone. They'd insist on going in pairs, or they'd schedule work during daylight hours only, never after dark. When pressed, they'd admit they'd heard it too, that sound, that voice, and something about it felt wrong. Not threatening exactly, just persistent. Like whoever was making the noise had been doing it for a very long time and wasn't going to stop. Palace employees started sharing stories, comparing experiences. Everyone heard the same thing. The whirring of a spinning wheel, a woman's voice muttering, coming from behind a specific wall in the southwest wing. The reports were so consistent from so many different people over several months that palace officials finally decided they had to investigate properly. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't rats or pipes or settling wood. This was something specific, something localized, something that needed to be explained. The Board of Works was called in. Official investigators, people whose job was to maintain the palace and understand its structure. They examined the wall where the sounds originated, studied the architecture, checked old building plans, and they realized something. The wall was thicker than it should be. There was space behind it. space that wasn't, accounted for in any floor plan they could find. A sealed room, or a corridor, or something, hidden, forgotten. They made the decision to break through. On the day they brought in tools to open the wall, workers and curious residents gathered. This had become palace gossip. Everyone wanted to know what was behind that wall. What was making those sounds? The workers started carefully, removing plaster, then bricks, slowly revealing what lay beyond. The first thing they noticed when the opening was large enough, the air that escaped was stale, musty, the smell of a space that hadn't been opened in a very long time. Then they widened the hole enough to look inside, and there it was, a small chamber, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, no windows, no other entrance, completely sealed. Inside, an old, much-used antique spinning wheel, not stored carefully, not covered, just sitting there, as if someone had been using it and simply stopped, left it. And then someone else had sealed the room and forgotten about it. The workers stepped inside carefully, dust thick on every surface, the spinning wheel in the centre. And here's what made everyone go silent. The old oak floorboards directly beneath the spinning wheel were worn away, grooved, indented where the treadle, the foot pedal, had struck them. Over and over, for years, maybe decades, someone had spent countless hours in this room, spinning, working, the repetitive motion of the treadle striking the same spot on the floor, again and again and again until it wore through the wood. This wasn't a spinning wheel that had been stored and forgotten. This was a spinning wheel that had been used extensively. And then the room had been sealed with it inside. Why? When had the room been sealed? By whom? And why leave the spinning wheel inside? No one had answers. But here's what they did know. The spinning wheel sounds the residents had been hearing for months. They'd been coming from this exact location, behind this exact wall, from a room that had been sealed for, well, no one knew how long. The discovery seemed to confirm the supernatural origin of the sounds. Who else but the ghost of Sybil Penn, disturbed from her 267-year rest, when workers opened her tomb, would haunt Hampton Court with the sound of a spinning wheel? Who else would choose that particular room, that particular instrument? The workers removed the spinning wheel, documented the chamber, eventually sealed it back up or incorporated it into the palace structure. Records aren't clear on what they did with it, but the sounds didn't stop. Even with the spinning wheel removed, even with the chamber discovered and opened, even with the mystery apparently solved, people still heard it. That whirring, that muttering, that persistent sound of someone working behind walls that should be silent. Witnesses reported whispered voices, phantom footsteps, inexplicable cold spots, a sepulchral voice, stealthy tread, the low whirring of an unseen spinning wheel, continuing even after the hidden room was found. By the 1880s, visual sightings began. Frequent accounts described seeing Mrs. Penn's tall, gaunt form around the haunted room and gallery, exactly corresponding with the appearance of the effigy on her tomb. The apparition became known as the Grey Lady, a tall spectral figure in a grey gown, sometimes described with a veil covering her face. The ghost was most frequently reported in Clock Court, the state apartments, and the Georgian rooms. Unlike Catherine Howard's anguished screaming or Jane Seymour's sorrowful candlelit wandering, Sybil Penn's manifestation was quieter. The sound of industry, of spinning, of continued domestic service, even in death. The Victorian era loved a good ghost story. And not just any ghost story. They wanted their ghost dripping with meaning, with tragedy, with moral lessons about duty and devotion. Spiritualism was booming. The Fox sisters in America were claiming to communicate with the dead through mysterious rapping sounds. Mediums were hosting seances in London, parlours where aristocrats paid good money to speak with departed loved ones. Gothic novels were everywhere. Wuthering Heights, The Woman in White, stories of haunted moors and mysterious figures, and the past refusing to stay buried. People believed the dead weren't really gone. They were close, just behind a thin veil, watching, waiting, sometimes reaching through. So when the spinning wheel sound started in 1829, right after Sybil Penn's tomb was disturbed, the narrative practically wrote itself. A devoted Tudor servant, loyal unto death, her grave desecrated, her rest disturbed, and now she's back, continuing the work she did in life. It's a perfect Victorian ghost story, but the reports didn't stop when Victoria died. They didn't fade with the spiritualist movement when scientists debunked the Fox sisters and exposed fraudulent mediums. They continued, through the Edwardian era, through 2 world wars, into the modern age, and they got more specific. The Ponsonby family's original reports were just sounds, whirring, muttering, always from the same location, always in the southwest wing. But by the 1880s, people started seeing her. Mrs. Penn's tall, gaunt form. That's how they described it. Not just any ghost, not a vague shadow or mysterious figure, but specifically corresponding with the appearance of the effigy on her tomb. She was tall. She wore grey. Sometimes a veil covered her face. She appeared in Clock Court, in the state apartments, in the Georgian rooms. Palace employees started to recognise the pattern. Late at night, when the tourists had gone home and the vast rooms fell silent, they'd hear it. That rhythmic whirring, sometimes accompanied by footsteps, sometimes by whispered voices. Guards doing night rounds reported cold spots, places where the temperature dropped 20 degrees in a matter of steps, where your breath suddenly fogged, where the hair on the back of your neck stood up. Maintenance workers refused to go into certain rooms alone after dark. Tour guides noticed that visitors, who knew nothing about the hauntings, would suddenly stop in specific locations, comment on feeling watched, ask if anyone else felt cold, report seeing movement out of the corner of their eye, always in the same places. In May 2000, Hampton Court Palace became the site of the first ever scientific paranormal investigation at a British royal palace. But what happened 3 years later would make even the scientists reconsider their conclusions. Psychologist Richard Wiseman from the University of Hertfordshire assembled his team. Caroline Watt from Edinburgh University, Paul Stevens, Emma Greening, Ciaran O'Keefe. They weren't believers, they were scientists. Their goal wasn't to prove ghosts exist, it was to understand why so many people reported unusual experiences in specific locations. Between May 27th and June 4th, they ran an experiment. Participants, both believers and skeptics, walked through designated areas of the palace, the haunted gallery, the Georgian rooms, other locations where phenomena had been reported. They were told to mark on floor plans anywhere they experienced something unusual, anything at all. Cold spots, strange sounds, feelings of being watched, visual anomalies, whatever. Meanwhile, Wiseman's team took measurements, magnetic fields, temperature variations, air movement, lighting conditions, architectural features. The hypothesis? If ghosts exist, believers and skeptics should report different experiences. Believers would see ghosts because they're looking for them. Skeptics wouldn't because they don't believe. But that's not what happened. While believers reported more phenomena overall, they were more attuned to unusual experiences, more likely to interpret ambiguous stimuli as paranormal. Both believers and non-believers reported more unusual incidents in the same specific locations. The haunted gallery was the primary hotspot. Everyone felt something there, believers and skeptics alike. The Georgian rooms were the secondary hotspot. Again, both groups reported unusual experiences, not everywhere in the palace, just specific spots. The study found partial correlation between experience locations and local magnetic fields. Areas with stronger magnetic fields correlated with more reports of unusual experiences. There's a scientific basis for this. Magnetic fields can affect the temporal lobes of the brain, create feelings of a presence, produce hallucinations, trigger emotional responses. But the correlation wasn't perfect. Some high magnetic field areas produced no reports. Some low magnetic field areas did. Wiseman concluded that natural explanations, subtle drafts creating the sensation of touch, dark atmospheric settings priming expectation, magnetic fields affecting perception, infrasound below human hearing causing unease could account for many experiences. But he didn't say all experiences. He maintained an agnostic position. Maybe there actually are ghosts at the palace, he said, though natural explanations seemed more likely. The key finding? Something about those spaces affects people, both believers and skeptics, both those expecting ghosts and those certain they don't exist. Something is happening. In October 2003, Hampton Court's CCTV system captured what became known as the Skeletor incident, state-of-the-art security cameras monitoring the palace around the clock. On 3 consecutive nights, something strange appeared on the monitors. Fire doors near Clock Court flew open, with great force, around 1 p.m. each time, then closed, on their own. Security guards checked the footage, rewound it, watched it again. On the first night, just the doors opening and closing, no explanation visible. On the second night, here's where it gets interesting. The footage showed a figure, a tall figure, in period dress, wearing a head-to-toe hooded robe, reaching out and closing the doors. The figure's face appeared white, blank. No features visible, just a pale oval where a face should be. Later analysis suggested this was compression artifacts, the way security footage pixelates and loses detail. But at the time, to the security guards watching, it looked wrong, inhuman. Palace security was shocked. Vicky Wood, head of media and PR, made a public statement. "I was shocked when the CCTV footage showed an eerie figure in period dress in the doorway. It was incredibly spooky because the face just didn't look human. They released the footage to the media. It went viral, or as viral as things went in 2003, before YouTube and social media as we know them now. Here's what made it really compelling. An Australian tourist had written in the visitor book on the second day, before anyone knew about the footage, before the media attention. She'd seen something in that exact area. A ghost, she wrote, in period costume. Palace officials checked. None of the costumed interpreters, the guides who dress in Tudor clothing for tours, owned anything like what the figure was wearing. The robe was wrong, the style was wrong, the colour was wrong, and the costumed interpreters had schedules, shift records. None of them were in that area at that time on any of those 3 nights. The incident became known as the Skeletor incident because of the blank white face. Skeptics noted the timing. The footage emerged just as Hampton Court was opening a new exhibition on ghosts and hauntings. Perfect publicity. But the fire doors did open. That's documented. 3 nights in a row, around the same time. Something triggered them. Fire doors are heavy. They don't just fly open from drafts or air pressure. They're designed to stay closed unless actively opened. And the figure? Whether it was a ghost, a person in costume playing a prank, or a quirk of security footage compression, someone closed those doors. To this day, no one has come forward to admit it was them. No employee, no prankster, no one. The footage is still available. You can watch it yourself, draw your own conclusions. But Palace security still doesn't have an explanation for what triggered those doors, or who or what closed them. In February 2015, the King's Apartments, a 12-year-old girl named Holly Hampshire taking photos of her cousin, Brooke McGee. Tourist photos, vacation snapshots, nothing special. They're posing, smiling, taking turns with the camera, just kids having fun at a historic palace. Holly snaps a photo of Brooke standing in one of the grand rooms. Brooke is smiling at the camera, alone in frame, or so they thought. When they reviewed the photos later, back at their hotel, scrolling through the day's pictures, they found something else. A tall, dark figure standing directly behind Brooke. Tumbling dark hair, cascading below the waist. Wearing what looked like a grey or black gown. Appearing nearly twice Brooke's height. Maybe 7 or 8 feet tall. Neither girl had seen anything at the time. The room had been empty, except for them. They were sure of it. Brooke's reaction. I was totally freaked out. I didn't see anything. People say the room goes cold when ghosts appear, but we had no idea. We haven't slept properly since. The photo was examined by experts, widely reported in media, shared thousands of times online. Skeptics noted that the figure appeared solid, with highlights and shadows consistent with room lighting. Not transparent, not glowing, not obviously paranormal. Possibly a person in period costume who walked into frame just as the photo was snapped. Holly and Brooke noticed their cousin in the viewfinder, not the background. Easy to miss someone walking by. But both girls insist they saw no one. The room was empty, and the figure's height is wrong. Way too tall, even accounting for perspective and camera angles. The photo remains unexplained. Even skeptics have experiences at Hampton Court. Lucy Worsley, Chief Curator of Historic Royal Palaces, historian, television presenter, self-described ghost skeptic. She admits experiencing a feeling of coldness in the haunted gallery. Not everywhere in the gallery, just one specific corner, where 2 arms of the gallery meet, near a hidden jib door leading to curators' offices. She doesn't claim it's supernatural, doesn't say it's proof of ghosts, but she acknowledges feeling something. After the haunted gallery was redecorated in 2009, new wallpaper, new lighting, general refurbishment, ghost tour guide Sarah Slater noticed something interesting. Fewer people reported fainting and feeling dizzy in the room. Not 0, but fewer. The redecoration changed something about the space. The atmosphere, the way light and shadow fell, the way sound echoed, and the ghost reports decreased. Which suggests, though doesn't prove, that environmental factors play a significant role, but they didn't disappear entirely. People still report cold spots, still see figures, still hear sounds that shouldn't be there, just less frequently. And it's happening today. In October 2023, just last year, a TikTok user visiting Hampton Court captured audio on their phone during a late afternoon tour. They were filming the Georgian rooms, narrating for their followers, normal tourist content. When they reviewed the footage later, there was something in the background, faint but audible, that whirring sound, like a spinning wheel. The user hadn't heard it at the time. No one else in the tour group mentioned it, but it was there on the recording, rhythmic, persistent, lasting about 40 seconds before fading out. The video went viral, over 2 million views. Comments ranged from obviously fake to I heard that exact sound when I visited in 2019. Hampton Court's official social media accounts didn't confirm or deny, just posted their usual response. Many visitors report unusual experiences at the palace. We encourage everyone to visit and form their own conclusions. In March 2024, Palace security reviewed CCTV footage after a motion sensor was triggered in the Georgian rooms. At 2 a.m, the building was closed, empty, locked. The footage showed nothing, no person, no animal, no obvious cause for the sensor activation. But in the enhanced audio from the security camera, if you listen carefully, there's that sound again. Faint, distant, a whirring, a murmuring. It wasn't released publicly, but multiple palace employees have confirmed its existence. The Grey Lady isn't a Victorian legend that faded with time. She's being reported now, being recorded now, showing up on cameras and audio equipment and in the experiences of visitors who have no idea they're standing in a haunted room until they feel that sudden coldness, or hear that sound, or see that figure in grey. Today, Hampton Court offers regular evening ghost tours, Fridays, Saturdays and Sundays, between Halloween and the end of March. Tours at 7 p.m, 8 p.m, and 8:30 p.m, strictly for those over 15, too scary for younger kids. The Grey Lady features prominently alongside Catherine Howard, screaming as she runs through the haunted gallery, trying to reach Henry VIII before her execution, and Jane Seymour walking with a candle on the anniversary of her son Edward's birth. 3 queens or queen-adjacent women, all connected to Henry VIII, all supposedly here. The palace website presents the stories with balanced skepticism, acknowledging that nobody knew better than the Victorians that terror sells tickets. They're honest about the commercial aspect. Ghost tours bring in revenue, create publicity, draw visitors who might not otherwise come. But the website also notes that something is happening in specific locations. Even if the cause remains unclear, they don't claim the ghosts are real, but they don't claim they're fake either. It's a careful balance, respecting both believers and skeptics, presenting the history and the legend without committing to either interpretation. Tour guides are trained to share the stories without endorsing them, to talk about what people have reported without claiming they've experienced it themselves. Though some guides admit, off the record, that they've felt things, seen things, heard things they can't explain. One guide described working a late shift alone in the Georgian rooms, setting up for the next day's tours, moving barriers, checking displays, and hearing it. That faint whirring sound, like a spinning wheel, coming from a room she'd just checked. She knew it was empty. She'd just been in there, but she heard it clearly, for maybe 30 seconds, then it stopped. She went back to check. Nothing there. No spinning wheel, no person, no explanation. She finished her shift, locked up, went home, never reported it officially, because what would she say? I heard a ghost spinning, but she tells the story sometimes, late at night, after tours, to other guides who've had similar experiences. They don't talk about it much, don't want to be seen as flaky or unprofessional, but they acknowledge it to each other. Something happens in that palace, not to everyone, not every time, not predictably or consistently, but sometimes. When you're alone, when it's quiet, when you're not looking for it, you hear it, that faint whirring, like a spinning wheel, or you feel it, that sudden coldness, like stepping into a walk-in freezer, or you see it, out of the corner of your eye, a tall figure in grey, gone when you turn to look directly. So was Sybil Penn the Grey Lady? I can't give you a definitive answer. No one can, but here's what we know for certain. Sybil Penn existed, served 4 Tudor monarchs with unprecedented loyalty, raised the boy who would briefly become king, nursed 2 queens, died caring for Elizabeth I. For 267 years, she rested peacefully. Then her tomb was disturbed, and immediately, strange things started happening. The spinning wheel sounds, the discovery of the sealed room, the visual sightings that match her tomb effigy, the reports that have continued for nearly 200 years across different eras and belief systems. Scientific investigations confirm that specific locations at Hampton Court produce unusual experiences in both believers and skeptics. Something about those spaces affects perception. Whether it's magnetic fields, architectural features, atmospheric pressure, or something else, something is there. The legend persists because it resonates. It tells a story about devotion that transcends death, about service that never ends, about loyalty so absolute it might last forever. Whether the Grey Lady is literally the ghost of Sybil Penn or a psychological phenomenon created by history and atmosphere, or something in between, she's real to the people who experience her. She's real in the sense that she affects people, changes them, stays with them. And maybe that's what ghosts are. Not spirits of the dead, but memories so powerful they become part of the places where they happened. Hampton Court is saturated with 500 years of history. Kings and queens, births and deaths, betrayals and executions, love and loss, and everything in between. Sybil Penn is part of that history. 24 years of service, a life given for a queen, a legacy that endures through her descendants and through the legend of the Grey Lady. She's there, whether as ghost or memory or the power of suggestion in an atmospheric space, she's there. Thanks for staying with me tonight. If you made it this far, drop a comment and let me know what you think. Have you been to Hampton Court? Have you seen the Grey Lady? Have you heard the spinning wheel? Let's talk about it. And if you want more stories like this, stories about Tudor history, about ghosts, about the thin places where past and present overlap, subscribe. Because we're just getting started. There are more haunted palaces, more mysterious deaths, more stories that blur the line between history and legend. Sleep well tonight. Or try to anyway. Because now you know about Sybil Penn, the woman who gave her life for a queen, who nursed a prince through fever, who served 4 monarchs without disgrace or blame, who died of smallpox in 1562 and rested peacefully for 267 years, until someone disturbed her grave. And if you're ever at Hampton Court Palace, walking through those atmospheric galleries in the fading afternoon light, when tour groups have thinned out and the vast rooms feel suddenly larger, you might want to pay attention to that corner in the haunted gallery where it's always colder than it should be, to the Georgian rooms where your phone battery drains for no reason, to that faint sound you can't quite identify, rhythmic, distant, like something turning, like a wheel spinning. You'll probably tell yourself it's pipes, or heating, or old wood settling. But then you'll feel it, that sudden drop in temperature, that weight on your shoulders, that unmistakable sensation of being watched by someone you can't see. And if you're very unlucky, or very lucky depending on how you look at it, you might catch a glimpse out of the corner of your eye. A tall figure, dressed in grey, moving through a doorway that shouldn't have anyone in it. Gone when you turn to look directly, but you'll know what you saw. The Grey Lady, Sybil Penn. Almost 200 years after someone broke down that wall and found the room she'd made her own. Her tomb was destroyed, her remains scattered, her monument moved, but she never left. She's there in the palace, where she gave 24 years of her life. There in the rooms where she held a frightened prince, where she nursed 2 queens, where she contracted smallpox and died doing the only thing she'd ever done, taking care of people. Some kinds of devotion don't end with death. Some kinds of loyalty transcend the grave, and some women, when disturbed from their rest, don't scream or weep or seek vengeance. They just go back to work. The sound of the spinning wheel continues, faint, persistent, always in the same location. The Grey Lady walks the galleries, tall, silent, watching. Sybil Penn never stopped serving. Not in 1562 when smallpox killed her, not in 1829 when her tomb was destroyed. Not now. She's there. She'll always be there. And if you're very quiet, very still, very patient, you might hear it too. That whirring sound. Like a spinning wheel. Like someone who has work to do. Like someone who made a promise to care for princes and queens. And even death couldn't break it. Good night. Sweet dreams. And remember, when you hear strange sounds in old buildings, when you feel sudden cold where there shouldn't be any, when you see figures that disappear when you look directly at them, maybe it's nothing, or maybe it's Sybil Penn, still working, still spinning, still there.